Quebec just released its report on gender identity today and essentially ignored every queer organization when doing so. In December of 2023, Quebec had said that they would have a committee of sages who would investigate the question of gender identity. And that committee, lo and behold, was contained of nothing but cis people who know nothing about trans people and intersex people in Quebec. These are the three sages that looked into the question. Quebec was very proud to announce this, despite this being like having a committee on the status of women and only having cis men in that committee. But that's too inconvenient for them to have people who are concerned, because then they would have to humanize us instead of having this amorphous construct in their minds of who trans people are. Now, my friend Celeste went through the document, and here are some of the key things that came out of it. One thing that seemed clear out of this report is that they're doing like the EHRC did in the UK, where they're putting an unscientific and unjustified emphasis on sex rather than gender, oftentimes parroting very transphobic talking points and things that are very akin to separate but equal in the discourse. Might I remind you, separate but equal has never been a good thing. And they kept trying to paint women's rights as if they were diametrically opposed to trans rights, which if you're an actual feminist, you would know that they're not opposed. In fact, they're oftentimes intrinsically linked together. And while this report tries to play both sides, it ends up inevitably recommending things that are opposed to even the things that they mention. For example, that they do mention that there's discrimination against trans people and that we should do something about it. Then in the same phrase, they'll try to justify trying to separate trans people from the spaces that we belong in. This report also puts forward this idea of social contagion, which has been thoroughly debunked. And it also talks about rapid onset gender dysphoria, which, might I remind you, is a completely debunked theory. As pointed out by Celeste, a lot of the stuff that they say in there are just stereotypes that are parroted by transphobes and TERFs, which TERFs are transphobes. And these stereotypes are meant to further encourage anti-trans laws against us. And these anti-trans laws will inevitably hurt cis women too. We've seen this happen. Danny Davis at Walmart, who got harassed by a man who wanted to beat her up. The lesbian girl who got stomped on at a McDonald's, being called the F slur. The report also talks about the cast review as if it's a legitimate thing, which, might I remind you, the cast review has been debunked by people from Yale, by medical associations, and some of the recommendations might lead to more gatekeeping when it comes to gender-affirming care for trans people, because it puts emphasis on the medicalization of trans people and how we should really take caution when allowing trans people to have our healthcare, making a clear distinction that there should be a cis healthcare and a trans healthcare that is very separate from cis healthcare. Because whether they want it or not, that's what it's going to lead to. For some reason, trans people are subject to different conditions and different level of scrutiny than cis people's healthcare. And because in the report they keep putting this emphasis on a binary sex that's immovable and immutable, they completely ignored the reality of both medical transition, but also intersex people who do not fit in a binary. And no human actually fits in a binary when it comes to sex. There's a reason that some of us have our papers and our medical records listed as female for trans women who have undergone HRT, who have undergone certain surgery. And the same thing for some trans men. Is this the case for everyone? No, but that's the point. It's not binary. Intersex people exist and trans people who are medically transitioning exist, which means that it's anything but binary. But because they were only listening to TERFs and to transphobes, they are unable to see how unscientific that stance in their recommendations are. Sex is a spectrum, babes. When it comes to trans youth, however, there is one thing that I'll give them, is that they're not going as far as Alberta or Saskatchewan when it comes to trying to forcibly detransition kids. They do recommend to teachers and professionals to encourage the child to tell their parents, but they're not forcing it as such. It's not great, but it's not what Alberta and Saskatchewan are trying to do. And when it comes to talking about gender identity to youth, they are putting a heavy emphasis, like the UK is doing, to really clearly mention that sex is immutable and is very different from gender, which is unscientific. Yes, it's different than gender, but it is not immutable and it is not immovable. And when it comes to bathrooms, to changing rooms, to shelters, the guidance also tried to put a heavy emphasis on the separate but equal guidance, which again, white cis people learn from fucking history. And I have to agree with my friend's conclusion here. This report is just transmisogyny and misogyny at a provincial level, hidden behind concern trolling and transphobic and homophobic language overall. This report serves no one but to comfort the feelings of bigoted people in Quebec. So now it's up to Quebec to decide whether or not they're going to go down this culture war, transphobic, and misogynistic route. But this report is what happens when you do a report on a concerned demographic without the concerned demographic in the room to talk about what we actually face and experience. And if we do see any separate but equal guidance being implemented, I think all three of these sages should know no peace, and our government should also know no peace until we have equality restored in Quebec.